Welcome. My name is Whitney Lee. I'm a developer advocate, and I'm here with Adriana. Adriana, will you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. My name is Adriana Villela. I am a CNCF ambassador and a HashiCorp ambassador and a blogger and a podcaster. Happy to be here.
Amazing. Oh, so happy to have you. So you and I just had a blast having a conversation. I think it was about an hour and a half long. And we talked about Observability 2.0. And we filled up this whole board with all kinds of information about it. And we're going to recap our long conversation now. For those of you who only have a little bit of time, but you want to get the information. Let's start by talking about what is observability, just period, regardless of 1.0 or 2.0. Yeah, what's observability?
So observability is the ability to ask meaningful questions about your system and get useful answers.
And so we talked about observability 1.0. So how observability used to be. So let's talk about that a little bit so we can understand how it's evolved.
When Observability 1.0 came out, it was hot on the heels of APM. I think a lot of vendors at that point were not fully certain as to what this observability thing was. And so there was a lot of reframing of like, oh, I'm an APM vendor. Now we're an observability vendor, which is fine. You know, these things evolve. They got to start somewhere. It evolved from APM. But then we were with that mindset, right?
What you taught me is like basically people were collecting logs, metrics, and traces, but without having an idea of how they fit together.
Exactly. There was that aspect. It was mostly focused on operations. So, you know, developers were not really involved as part of this. There was also like our architectures were a lot simpler. So there was more of this focus on the known unknowns rather than the unknown unknowns. That was the main thing. So we had like, you know, we had this word observability out there. It was new, exciting, but we didn't know what to do with it. So we didn't quite fulfill the promise because it's fine, right? Like it's the first time you're touching something, like you learn how to code in a language. Yeah. You're not going to write great code initially. And that's okay, but you'll evolve to write better code as you get more experience with it.
Back before Observability 2.0, the job of trying to understand how these things relate to each other, it was in the tools themselves that was trying to add the correlation between the logs, metrics, and traces. With Observability 2.0, the focus is on getting these all to work together to give a holistic view of the system. I want to say quickly, as someone new to observability, logs, metrics, and traces together can be referred to as the signals, and they can also be referred to as the three pillars. But you said you don't love three pillars.
I don't. Yeah, because it implies silos.
That they can't be. And really, they're like a braid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because like logs, metrics, and traces, they're things that are emitted by your system. So I feel like signals is a much more elegant way to refer to them, or as you said, a braid. And I also want to just mention for Observability 1.0, I would say distributed tracing was not as much part of the narrative. Like there was this huge, still like huge emphasis on logs and metrics, and traces still confused people, which is fine. Like it's a new concept and you might have like some internalization in your mind as to what you think it is, and that doesn't match with reality. So you might have had all three signals. Most likely you probably didn't. Maybe not even as much of the right ones as you needed for the things that you're doing. So
I like to think of observability, like old school observability. Their systems were more like platform games. They were more like Super Mario Brothers, and they knew the edges of the system. In that case, logs and metrics were enough for them to be able to get a pretty good picture of what was happening. But now we're with distributed systems and being able to auto scale and everything else, we're making systems that are more like Minecraft, that are more like procedurally generated video games. And so how can we keep an eye on that? And tracing is part of that, adding traces, but also what you said is not telemetry data being all united under a common framework, which is OpenTelemetry, is really what unlocks Observability 2.0. So we talk about OpenTelemetry, a quick refresher of the two parts of OpenTelemetry.
Using OpenTelemetry does not give you observability, but it is an enabler. So super important to keep in mind. So you've got OpenTelemetry has the standards. So it's got the APIs, which it defines the methods for instrumenting your applications. And then we've got the SDKs that determine how your telemetry is generated and correlated. And then you've got the OTel collector, which you can look at it as a data pipeline. It ingests your data, and then it'll transform your data, and there's different ways to transform it. You can add and remove attributes, you can mask data, you can batch your data, you can sample your data, and then you have to send your data somewhere, and that somewhere is going to be an observability backend, either a backend that accepts OTLP, which is the OpenTelemetry protocol natively, or if it doesn't, there are specific types of exporters for different observability backends that convert from OTLP to whatever that backend's native format is.
So now I understand observability used to be a little bit rigid in how it was collected and not really knowing how it all relates to each other. Now we've added more of an emphasis on traces and this common framework, OpenTelemetry, to help us understand how things work together. But now the big question is, okay, I understand the theory, but like, what about in practice? What do you actually do to get this working at your company? One thing you already said, which is OpenTelemetry enables observability, but doesn't mean you just get observability. You have to collect the right data, and you have to know what to do with that data once it's collected. But you outlined some steps for making that happen, which are very exciting to me. I love some steps. So we're talking about how to get started adding observability to your system development lifecycle.
Yeah, so specifically, like this is for adding OpenTelemetry to your SDLC, which starts with the developer, because in the difference between Observability 1.0 and 2.0 is that we are shifting left on observability, and we're making sure that we want folks involved as early on in the process. So your system development lifecycle, SDLC, developer instruments their code. In the same way that they would write logs in their code, we want them to add other types of instrumentation, whether it's traces, logs, metrics. Actually, ideally, we want all three, and ideally, we do want to still emphasize the trace, because the trace, I think, is the anchor for really enabling observability with our logs and metrics as our supporting actors. So making sure that the developer does that. And the idea is, as the developer is debugging, they can use their instrumented code to help surface their bugs. Awesome. And then when we hand it over to QAs, the QAs, they have instrumented code, which means they can pop into the observability backend, and as they're running their tests, maybe they encounter a bug and they're like, hey, I can use the telemetry data to troubleshoot what's going on, understand like what's causing this bug, so I can report back to the developer and say, hey, you have a bug and this is why. Or conversely, if there's a bug and they can't figure out why, they can go back to the developer and say, hey, I think this is under-instrumented. So now we have that lovely feedback loop between the developers and the QAs. But wait, there's more, because the QAs can also use the instrumented data, and specifically the traces, to create trace-based tests, or TBT. Traces, basically, they're just structured data, right? Think of like JSON. It's got key value pairs. It's got attributes that help to give us information about the trace. So you can use trace-based testing to basically write assertions based on things from your trace attributes that you expect to see versus what you don't expect to see. And so now you've got these integration tests that are language agnostic, because, in our microservice world, oftentimes we are writing in multiple languages, maybe different ones for front end and back end. And this gives us this unified way to test our stuff.
What I like about these steps, or how we've laid this out, is like step 1 and 2, it's like you're in the application. You're there with the developer. You're getting it in there, and it's iterative. And then step 3 is like, okay, I'm zooming out a little bit and understanding how the services near one another interact with the others. And now with step 4 and 5, we're zooming out and being like, okay, how does this look system-wide? For SREs, how does this instrumentation help?
The SREs are like the ultimate benefactors of all this instrumentation, right? Because they're probably the ones who are going to be troubleshooting the code when things go sideways. So now your code's been instrumented. You've had the extra vetting from your QA team. It's not going to be perfect, because no code is perfect, no code is done, but hopefully you have enough information that you can troubleshoot. So that's number 1. But number two, because the code is instrumented, and specifically now we're talking about metrics. So metrics are used to define SLIs, and SLIs are used to define SLOs. Well, SREs need to define SLOs, so they have now the information to be able to define their SLOs. But furthermore, because under Observability 2.0, we have that correlation between our metrics and our traces. Well, we have the correlation between all the signals. Then that means that when an SLO is breached, they can go from SLO to SLI to metric to corresponding trace to actually help narrow in on the problem, which
So not only like making connections between all the different services, but also making connections between all the different personas and how they work together. That's awesome. So then we talked about one last thing that's the cherry on top, which is observability and OpenTelemetry as it relates to a CI/CD pipeline. Will you go over that? Yeah.
Yeah, because as it turns out, you can make your CI/CD pipelines observable, and it actually makes a lot of sense because these are the things that are packaging up your code and then delivering your code into production, right? When they work well, they work great, but when they're not working well, and they are code, right? Our CI/CD pipelines are defined as code, and therefore, if things are going sideways with our CI/CD pipelines, we need to debug them. So by having observable CI/CD pipelines, we have the means of doing so. And I'd say the only downside is there's no coherent narrative around the tooling for observable CI/CD pipelines. It's a little bit of a free-for-all. It depends on who you're using for your pipelines, for example. So Jenkins and Tecton have OpenTelemetry plugins. So then they emit OpenTelemetry signals about your pipelines. And then like tools like GitHub, GitLab, I think it's up to using someone else's plugin, like a third-party plugin, which may be a little bit risky because, you're relying on a third-party plugin, you don't know anything about them, and B, if they stop maintaining, you might be up a creek. But then there are some other tools that do have like OTel support. So like Ansible, for example, if you're using that for orchestrating your deployments, there's a plugin for OTel for Ansible. Maven does have an OTel plugin. And then there's this great tool created by Amy Toby called the OTel CLI, which basically is OTel for your bash scripts, which is amazing because, if you use bash scripts in your CI/CD pipelines, well, you've got that extra little bit of visibility, and that one emits traces. So super cool that we have that sort of thing going on. There's definitely more work to be done, but I think it's very exciting that we're talking more about the observability of CI/CD pipelines because they're important.
So I've learned so much today. I learned about Observability 2.0 and how we can use the logs, metrics, and traces and how we can make them work together to get a holistic view of the system. And specifically with the goal of being able to ask meaningful questions of your system and receiving useful answers. And also with the benefit of knowing about your problems before your end users do, which is pretty incredible. Yeah.
That one really is up to your observability tool to help surface that because OpenTelemetry alone won't do that. But a good observability tool should be able to identify like common patterns and say, this looks a little bit wonky here. Maybe you want to look over here.
Right on. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
I would say, observability is one of those things that's here to stay. Let's continue to shift the narrative from Observability 1.0 to 2.0 so that we can really fulfill the promise of observability to really give us those insights into our systems because honestly, the stuff just makes our lives better. And don't we want to just have better tech lives?
100%. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with me this morning, Adriana. And thanks everyone who watches this recording. Bye.